Glad you're joining us. We're in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6 is built around three major scenes. The first scene is the Lord of the Sabbath, which occurs in verses 1 through 11. The second scene is the appointing of the disciples in 12 through 16. The third scene is the teaching on holiness, which is verses 17 through 46. A good way to summarize the teachings and actions of the 6th chapter is that Jesus is going to solidify and give really titles that authenticate the 12 disciples. And he's going to call his disciples, both the 12 and a broader audience, to holy living. And Jesus is going to redefine what holiness looks like, in contrast to the teachings of the Pharisees. Again, Luke is very keen to point out geographical settings and locations for his gospel account. And we are continuing in the Galilee ministry of Jesus. And so we are where that big red or pinkish colored X is located, on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And here in the grain fields and the synagogues and on the hillsides, the 6th chapter plays out. This is a good close-up map. We looked at this one last week, but I want to draw your attention to it again this week. You'll notice at center right, a little bit above, between the area of Gennesareth and Capernaum, near the city of Tavda. I didn't quite get the pronunciation of that one right. My Hebrew's a little rusty, I guess. But in that region is the traditional location for the Sermon on the Mount. And it's reasonable to conclude that when the disciples pass through the grain field and pick the heads of grain, or whether they're in the synagogue or whether on the hillside listening to Jesus preach and teach, we're really just centered in that part of the world. You know, Capernaum to Gennesareth, we're talking about an area of a couple miles. So don't think of this as a broad, sprawling area and covering hundreds of square miles. We're talking about a very small, very closely knit community and region, part of the world, particularly as it would have been in the time of Jesus. Here, Jesus is going to minister, he's going to teach, preach, and appoint his disciples. I wanted to give you a look at what a traditional Jewish synagogue would look like. And on the right-hand side, right picture, this is a picture of the modern-day ruins of the synagogue of Capernaum. Most of the synagogues were fairly similar in structure. And we see in the left-hand side a depiction by an artist of what the synagogue would have originally looked like in the time and day of Jesus. Now, both of these are looking in the same general direction, and so they are very good side-by-side comparisons. Probably the only real difference between what a modern-day church facility, sanctuary would differ with that of a Jewish synagogue is that in the synagogue, the congregation stands while the speaker is seated. Where in the church service, modern-day church service, the general rule is for the congregation to be seated and the speaker to stand. So we tend to invert what the Jewish people do as far as arrangements. However, in the general layout, it was relatively the same. In the area towards the back of the picture, towards the back of the facility, where the speaker would have been seated and read, there would have been an assortment of scrolls. One of the key features to the synagogues was that the people would pool their resources for the purchasing of scrolls that contained the various books of the Old Testament. The scrolls were so expensive and the general population illiterate, it really required the pooling of resources, financial resources, to purchase texts of scriptures, purchase the actual scrolls. And it would have been necessary to support one or two rabbis in a large community. And sometimes smaller communities like Capernaum would not have been able to afford one, but would have been dependent upon itinerant, rotating rabbis who would come in various Sabbaths to teach. And so that's another key location for Luke chapter 6. As I mentioned before, the conflict with the Pharisees really starts to break out into the open. As Luke chapter 6 begins, the Pharisees are passing through a grain field on the Sabbath. They begin to pick the heads of the grain and eat them because they are hungry. The prohibition on harvesting on the Sabbath was clearly established in Mosaic law. It constituted work and therefore was forbidden, and the Pharisees take extreme umbrage with the disciples' actions. On a subsequent Sabbath, might have been the next one or a couple later, Jesus finds himself in a synagogue, as we looked at in the previous pictures. And there, the Pharisees notice a man with a shriveled hand. And so they keep a very keen and an astute eye on Jesus because they want to see if Jesus will heal on the Sabbath. Now, for us as modern evangelicals, this may not really seem like such a big deal, but we have to understand Jewish thinking at the time. In Jewish thought, holiness was about keeping the law. Now, when Jesus comes along, he rightly recenters that thought, because he kind of goes back and asks the question, well, what is the core of the law? And the core of the law is to love God and to love our neighbor. And all the other provisions of the law are subordinate to that overarching principle. And so when Jesus finds himself confronted with a man with a shriveled hand, and it happens to be the Sabbath, he recognizes that the call to love has not been muted by the Sabbath. And therefore, it is entirely permissible to heal on the Sabbath. That stands in opposite or in stark contrast with the Pharisees, who viewed it the complete opposite way. Their mindset would be, how dare you break the law on the Sabbath? That is to desecrate what is holy. And so Jesus is really fundamentally reworking the whole theme of law and holiness to refashion it as was originally intended. But again, that puts him in complete opposition and in stark contrast with the teachings of the Pharisees. If we were to take a modern evangelical doctrine like the atoning sacrifice or the virgin birth or the inspiration of the scriptures, for instance, imagine someone coming in and arguing against our orthodox views that we've held in the Western Church literally for centuries. It would be met with staunch resistance. And we have to understand that when Jesus comes in and starts to rework this concept of holiness, he is taking on the core doctrine of the Pharisees, a doctrine that they had spent literally centuries refining and was really the core of their teaching. So he's not picking a peripheral battle. He's not arguing about some nonsensical theological question like how many angels can fit on the head of a pin or some dumb thing like that. He's coming along and really attacking the core of their teaching. And that's what creates the intensity of the conflict. Now, in the midst of all of this, we move into a second scene. And in the second scene, Jesus is going to go up on a hillside, spend the night in prayer. And this is the longest recorded prayer session in Luke's gospel. I think it's the longest recorded, attested prayer section in all of the gospels. And the subject of Jesus' prayer time is whom he will appoint to be apostles, to be the disciples. Now, this constitutes one of the most significant decisions that Jesus is going to make in his time of ministry. He recognizes his time is short. By the time he goes up on this mountainside to pray, he probably has only about 2.5 years until the crucifixion. And so who he will turn over the ministry to is an incredibly important question. It comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. And because this is such a significant decision, he allots himself this time of prayer. We find here then one of the key principles of ministry. If we are making key or significant decisions, or when we engage in ministry, we ought to do so having prayed. We ought to do ministry and pray at the same time. And then in the afterload of ministry, we ought to pray. Prayer is what is done before, during, and after ministry. In that sense, Jesus does a great job of helping us remember a principle that is laid out in the Old Testament. It is evidenced very well in the ministry of Nehemiah. Prayer is not a substitute for action, nor is action a substitute for prayer. Prayer and action are meant to go hand in hand. Jesus doesn't just go up on a hillside and pray, nor does he just appoint the disciples. He prays and he appoints. He prays and he acts. So don't ever think of prayer as a thing we do to substitute action, and don't ever think of action as something that can substitute prayer. They are hand in glove, a tandem pair that are never meant to be separated. One can never substitute the other. They must go together. So Jesus goes up. He spends this prolonged time in prayer. He comes down from the mountain. He looks at the 12 and he says, "You are my disciples." This relationship of rabbi and disciple was a common one in Jewish culture. They would have understood what it had meant. They would have understood that now they are dedicating their life to following him as their teacher, as their rabbi. It is not surprising then that Luke moves from this instance immediately into a scene of Jesus teaching. The teaching that Jesus gives in the 6th chapter of Luke, we would often refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. I provided these couple of pictures. One is a landscape on the left. The other is of the Church of the Beatitudes on the right. And this kind of gives you a feel for what that region just off the Sea of Galilee looks like. It is open hillside country. It is one of the best places in Israel, perhaps in the world, because it provides such a natural amphitheater. You can stand up, and it's gradual hillside that slopes down. You can stand up and be seen for a long distance, and your voice can carry because of the low amount of brush or anything else. It's a place where you can easily speak to large groups. And it's here that Jesus gathers and he teaches. Luke points out a couple of key things. One of the first things that Luke points out that's fascinating is that in the midst of this group that Jesus will be preaching and teaching, there are his disciples, his followers, and those that are simply coming to kind of check him out. And some of them are from the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre and Sidon are in Phoenicia. So in this group of people who are listening to Jesus, there is a section of people who are not Jewish. Again, Luke is very clear that Jesus has come to seek and to save all who are lost, and that is a multi-ethnic ministry. So it's not surprising he would want to point out there are Gentiles in this audience. Now, Luke also wants to point out not just blessings, which we see recorded in Matthew's Gospel to a greater degree and greater length, but Luke also includes a series of woes. Now, prophetic ministry of the Old Testament, there was often blessings and woes. There was statements of commendation for certain countries, people, or groups. There was often statements of judgment versus various people, nations, or groups. And Jesus is definitely coming across in this moment as an Old Testament prophet. Key characteristic of a prophet is they are one who speaks on behalf of God. In the woes, specifically, what is singled out for attention is wealth, popularity, and keep in mind that in the mindset of Luke's original audience, again, he's writing to Theophilus, he's writing to a pagan, to a Gentile. If a Gentile received good reputation, was well liked, had great wealth and prosperity, that would have been seen as approval from the gods. So when Jesus is talking about woe to people who have that popularity and that wealth, that would have stood in stark contrast to the value system of a fallen pagan Gentile society. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, it would have also in some degree fallen in contrast to the teachings of the Pharisees. Pharisees really believed that in times wealth and prosperity and all those things were signs of God's approval. Here Jesus is taking, and he's defying conventional wisdom, both of Roman and Jewish society. And he's positing this belief that when we look at those external factors, we might be grossly led astray about what our spiritual health looks like. In other words, our spiritual health is not always evidenced in our bank accounts and by how busy our social life is. Those might be totally wrong indicators, misleading indicators of where we're actually at. And instead, Jesus says, well, let's look at some real grounds or testing or means of assessing if we're on the right track. And he launches out with this love for enemies teaching. If we can love those people who don't love us in return, then we're living out the love ethic that we're required to. Again, for Jesus, the apex of law is not the keeping of a bunch of rules. The apex is that we learn to love God and love our neighbor. That's the core of holiness, and that's the core of what it means to be a follower of Christ, or a follower of God in general. This had been lost in Judaism, had been lost in their teaching, had become totally supplanted, totally overshadowed by their keeping of the law. They had really degenerated into this place of believing that sin was out there in the world, and the law kept us from those things that are sinful, and we could therefore escape being contaminated by sin. Now, that is a totally unbiblical view of sin. The biblical view of sin is that sin emanates in the heart, it's endemic to all people, and it's only the love of God that can overcome our sinful nature. And so rather than looking at bank accounts or popularity, Jesus says, check your heart and how you feel towards those people who are awful to you, towards those who would naturally be your enemies. Do you have a genuine desire for their good? Have you forgiven them how they've wronged you? Do you love your enemies? That's a better question of spiritual maturity and a test of spiritual maturity. Jesus then moves into two sections that are extremely important, and unfortunately in Western society, as they've often been mistaught, they've been separated from each other as if they're two totally different, distinct teachings, but they're really not. They fit together. The first is the warning not to judge others. The second is the discerning piece we need to have. Judgment and discernment are being used here by Jesus to delineate two different ways of coming about or doing something. And again, the overarching question is, how do we assess holiness? How do we know we're on the right track? If we're not looking to popularity and bank account and approval and all those kinds of things, well, then what do we look at? First thing Jesus warns is this theme of judging. When we judge someone else incorrectly, we make two mistakes, one of two mistakes. The first one is we hold people to standards that are our own, but are not God's. You see this played out when Paul argues in 1 Corinthians. And Paul makes the case that when it comes to meat sacrificed to idols, there needs to be room for personal conviction. If you have a conviction about not doing something, or doing something, if you have a personal conviction, you are expected to follow your convictions. Conversely, you're also called to accept a brother who has a different set of convictions. And we are not subject to judgment regarding everyone else's personal convictions about stuff. The second warning in this judging piece, the second illegitimate part, is when we hold people to standards that we ourselves don't keep. That's why Jesus would talk about the plank in our eye and the speck of sawdust in someone else's eye. Our wrong actions, our violation of what's expected of the rules or of holiness or the law or whatever terms you want to describe, when we blow it, we got to see that. And how dare we go around and pick out what everyone else is doing wrong when we ourselves are doing that? Illustration of this that I was given when training for ministry was of a pastor who preached for several months on the dangers of infidelity and on sexual sin and just went on and on and on. A few months later, came to light that during that time period, he was having an affair. That's a clear violation of the very standards and expectations that Jesus is laying out here when he talks about judgment. It's not that God's standards of sexuality should not be upheld, but it's that we can't enforce those standards when we ourselves are not living in compliance with them. So those are the two major mistakes we make in judgment. We hold people not to the rules that God has laid out, but to our personal convictions, which is an unfair way to judge someone else, or we judge them on the very things that we ourselves are violating on, which is simply purely hypocritical. Rather than judging, what Jesus admonishes his followers to do is to discern. And he uses a metaphor, an agricultural metaphor, to describe how we ought to discern. In verse 43, he says, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognizable by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings out evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. There's probably no greater statement on the psychology of human beings in the scriptures than this one. Jesus points out the obvious. We are inside-out creatures. What we harbor in the heart will work its way out in action. It has to come out. Has to. And so rather than judge people's externals hypocritically or based on our personal convictions, we simply need to step back and look at the sum total of what someone's life looks like. And is it headed in a good or evil trajectory? We are people in process. We are people who grow and mature. We are people who are either becoming more like Christ or more like evil. We are people in motion. Just like a plant can grow and will eventually culminate in some type of fruit. So when we look at discerning things, we're looking at real categories of good and evil. Things that God has clearly laid out. And again, one of the key defining characteristics is if it's of love, the love of neighbors, the love of enemies, the seeking the good of others, even with no expectation of anything in return. That kind of love, that comes out of a regenerate heart and will flow its way out into behaviors that benefit others. If that love ethic doesn't take root in our heart, we'll continue to be people that are judgmental, hypocritical, mean, nasty, lacking in generosity, and so forth. So rather than make snap judgments about one or two particulars that we think are important, we need to look at people in the sum total of their life and in the trajectory they're moving and what are they growing and becoming. This kind of discernment is not something we can do quickly. It's not something we can do at first meeting of someone. It requires a real knowledge of someone else, and it requires a steady patience and objective framework. Where the snap, rash judgments of the Pharisees here are being contrasted with more calm, even-headed, collective, contemplative, is this someone who is trustworthy? Is this someone who's becoming more like Christ or not? Kinds of questioning. That is legitimate. That's legitimate. Particularly if it starts with our own heart and then we apply it to others. But that kind of a discernment is necessary in life. And so we should never separate judgment and say we shouldn't judge. We need to keep judgment and discernment together. Yeah, judgment is forbidden, but discernment is commanded. Jesus here isn't saying, well, don't judge and we'll just leave it there. He's saying, forego judgment, which you've inherited from your religious past or from society. Forgo that nonsense and instead really develop a radar, a discernment when you're dealing with others. So there's both a prohibition, do not judge, but there's also a prescription given here. Do become discerning people. I bristle when I hear one of those taught at the exclusion of the other. They are a tandem pair. They are not intended to be separated. Okay, I'm done preaching for a moment. Moving forward. As Jesus brings this Sermon on the Mount, this teaching section, to a close, he emphasizes counting the cost, and he uses the metaphor of the wise builder to do that. And he describes the wise builder as one who heeds his words and lays his house on a firm foundation, and the person who hears his words but doesn't heed them as the foolish person who builds his house on sand. The point Jesus is making is that as he preaches, as he teaches, his true followers, whose true listeners, by hearing his words and taking his words to heart, will find themselves preserved and not swept away in destruction. There is a definite eschatological, final, end-of-the-age judgment, white throne judgment kind of ring as Luke chapter 6 comes to a close. If I can back up and put a kind of a summary thought out here for a moment. We see that in the crowd, different tiers or layers. In the crowd, there are the disciples, the 12 who have been appointed. 11 of the 12 are going to be faithful many of them faithful unto death. They're fully committed followers of Christ. They're going to engage in ministry. They're going to travel the world. They're going to go all over. They're going to face persecution and hardship. They're going to go the extra mile to communicate the gospel message. They're your core group. There's a tier of followers who are committed, and then there is another tier of seekers. I think that some people wrongly have the idea that the church should only have one tier, should only have the hardcore committed followers. I argue that a church really should have all three tiers, and the goal is to move people from the outside to the inside. How do you transition people from seeker to follower, from follower to core member? Real contributor to the ministry and life of the church. So it's about bringing people through that process. And I think that what you'll see is in the laying of the gospel and in Acts, you see that movement. You see people come from the seeking group to the core group. They transition into the heart of the ministry as we see the apostles dying and the next generation of believers coming into leadership in their own right. The reason I throw that point out there is simply because I want to kind of lay out here this broader framework of discipleship. Discipleship isn't about aiming at developing a core group. Discipleship is about moving people through those various tiers or spheres of orbit around Christ and moving them closer to Christ. And the reason in the process, I should say, of how they move closer is again allowing his words to sink deeply in them, to transform them from the inside out. So that's really Jesus' take on discipleship. And again, summarizing the 6th chapter this way, the disciples are called out of the world and called into holy living. And very importantly, Jesus defines holiness distinctly from that of how the Pharisees did. And that puts them on their road to conflict. So as followers of Christ in this century, in this age, we are called not to be judgmental people, but we are called to be discerning people. We are called people to embrace the blessings that Jesus describes, to avoid those woes where we become consumed by judging our spirituality by external things that don't really matter. We are again called to that place of love. It's the apex of the law. It is the defining ethic of what it means to be holy. And love here, of course, requires sacrifice. Love here even goes so far as to seek the good of our enemies and those who do ill towards us. So it's a broad panoramic as Jesus is trying to weave together teachings that are meant to really cement his followers, to kind of get them out of the Pharisaical mindset that they had been raised in, to kind of wipe the slate clean and say we need to reframe some of these key teachings. And as he begins to lay out those key teachings, his disciples become increasingly less Pharisaical, increasingly less judgmental, increasingly more loving, compassionate, forgiving. They move from being very wishy-washy at times to very angry and animated at other times to more steadfast, level-headed in their approach to ministry. So there's a lot of transformation that we're going to see in the lives of the disciples, but it really starts here as Jesus lays out those core pieces of the apex of love, the call to holiness, to forego judgment, to really cultivate a keen sense of discernment and a willingness to count the cost and really allow his words to transform us. So it's some broad smattering on discipleship. We'll see more in the weeks to come as Jesus is going to further his understanding in it by teaching even more. So you're going to see these themes resurface again and again as we move into the teaching segments of 9, 10, 12, and into chapter 15. So hope you're enjoying the Gospel of Luke. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. Keep learning, keep reading, keep growing, keep studying, and I hope you all stay healthy. We'll see you soon.